Hi, this is UrantianArtist welcoming you to our 22nd podcast titled Adam and Eve, a Love Story. Now, this story of love and loyalty is a dramatic one as we see them created to be material sexual beings who are created to be together always. They loved each other from the beginning, and when called on a mission together, they prepared themselves for the challenges ahead. On a planetary mission, the material sons and daughters are commissioned to found the Adamic race of that world, a race designed eventually to amalgamate with the mortal inhabitants of that sphere, and that's on paper 37. In 75, it says, after more than 100 years of effort on Urantia, Adam was able to see very little progress outside the garden. The world at large did not seem to be improving much. The realization of race betterment appeared to be a long way off, and the situation seemed so desperate as to demand something for relief not embraced in the original plans. At least that is what often passed through Adam's mind, and he so expressed himself many times to Eve. Adam and his mate were loyal, but they were isolated from their kind, and they were sorely distressed by the sorry plight of their world. And then in 75, 1, the Adamic mission, an experimental, rebellion-seared, and isolated Urantia, was a formidable undertaking, and the material son and daughter early became aware of the difficulty and complexity of their planetary assignment. Nevertheless, they courageously set about the task of solving their manifold problems. But when they addressed themselves to the all-important work of eliminating the defective and degenerates from among the human strains, they were quite dismayed. They could see no way out of the dilemma, and they could not take counsel with their superiors on either Jerusalem or Urantia. Here they were, isolated, and day by day confronted with some new and complicated tangle, some problem that seemed to be unsolvable. Under normal conditions, the first work of a planetary Adam and Eve would be the coordination and blending of the races. But on Urantia, such a project seemed just about hopeless, for the races, while biologically fit, had never been purged of their retarded and defective strains. Adam and Eve found themselves on a sphere wholly unprepared for the proclamation of the brotherhood of man, a world groping about in abject spiritual darkness and cursed with confusion, worse confounded by the miscarriage of the mission of the preceding administration. Mind and morals were at a low level, and instead of beginning the task of effecting religious unity, they must begin all anew the work of converting the inhabitants to the most simple forms of religious belief. Instead of finding one language ready for adoption, they were confronted by the worldwide confusion of hundreds upon hundreds of local dialects. No atom of the planetary service was ever set down on a more difficult world. The obstacles seemed insuperable, and the problems beyond creature solution. They were isolated, and the tremendous sense of loneliness which bore down upon them was all the more heightened by the early departure of the Melchizedek receivers. Only indirectly, by means of the angelic orders, could they communicate with any being off the planet. And slowly their courage weakened, their spirits drooped, and sometimes their faith almost faltered. And this is the true picture of the consternation of these two noble souls as they pondered the tasks which confronted them. They were both keenly aware of the enormous undertaking involved in the execution of their planetary assignment. Probably no material sons of Nebadon were ever faced with such a difficult and seemingly hopeless task as confronted Adam and Eve in the sorry plight of Urantia. But they would have sometimes met with success had they been more foreseeing and patient. Both of them, especially Eve, were altogether too impatient. They were not willing to settle down to the long endurance test. They wanted to see some immediate results, and they did. But the results thus secured proved most disastrous, both to themselves and to their world. Caligasta paid frequent visits to the garden and held many conferences with Adam and Eve, but they were adamant to all his suggestions of compromise and shortcut adventures. They had before them enough of the results of rebellion to produce effective immunity against all such insinuating proposals. Even the young offspring of Adam were uninfluenced by the overtures of Caligasta, and of course neither Caligasta nor his associate had power to influence any individual against his will, much less to persuade the children of Adam to do wrong. It must be remembered that Caligasta was still the titular planetary prince of Urantia, a misguided but nevertheless high son of the local universe. He was not finally deposed until the times of Christ Michael on Urantia. But the fallen prince was persistent and determined. He soon gave up working on Adam and decided to try a wily flank attack on Eve. The evil one concluded that the only hope for success lay in the adroit employment of suitable persons belonging to the upper strata of the Nodite group, the descendants of his one-time corporal staff associates. And the plans were accordingly laid for entrapping the mother of the violet race. Now, it was furthest from Eve's intention ever to do anything which would militate against Adam's plans of jeopardize their planetary trust. Knowing the tendency of women to look upon immediate results rather than to plan farsightedly for more remote effects, the Melchizedeks, before departing, had especially enjoined Eve as to the peculiar dangers besetting their isolated position on the planet, and had in particular warned her never to stray from the side of her mate, that is, to attempt no personal or secret methods of furthering their mutual undertakings. Eve had most scrupulously carried out these instructions for more than 100 years, and it did not occur to her that any danger would attach to the increasingly private and confidential visits she was enjoying with a certain Nodite leader named Sarapatata. The whole affair developed so gradually and naturally that she was taken unawares. The garden dwellers had been in contact with the Nodites since the early days of Eden. From these mixed descendants of the defaulting members of Caligasta's staff, they had received much valuable help and cooperation, and through them the Edenic regime was now to meet its complete undoing and final overthrow. Adam had just finished his first 100 years on earth when Zarathustra, upon the death of his father, came to the leadership of the Western or Syrian Confederation of the Nodite tribes. Zarathustra was a brown-tinted man, a brilliant descendant of the one-time chief of the Dalmatia Commission on Health, mated with one of the master female minds of the blue race of those distant days. All down through the ages, this line had held authority and wielded a great influence among the Western Nodite tribes. Zarathustra had made several visits to the garden and had become deeply impressed with the righteousness of Adam's cause, and shortly after assuming the leadership of the Syrian Nodites, he announced his intention of establishing an affiliation with the work of Adam and Eve in the garden. And the majority of his people joined him in this program, and Adam was cheered by the news that the most powerful, most intelligent of all the neighboring tribes had swung over almost bodily to the support of the program for world improvement. It was decidedly heartening, and shortly after this event, Zarathustra and his new staff were entertained by Adam and Eve in their own home. Zarathustra became one of the most able and efficient of all Adam's lieutenants. He was entirely honest and thoroughly sincere in all of his activities. He was never conscious, even later on, that he was being used as a circumstantial tool of the wily Caligasta. Presently, Zarathustra became the associate chairman of the Edenic Commission on Tribal Relations, and many plans were laid for the more vigorous prosecution of the work of winning the remote tribes to the cause of the garden. He held many conferences with Adam and Eve, especially with Eve, and they talked over many plans for improving their methods. One day during a talk with Eve, it occurred to Zarathustra that it would be very helpful if, while awaiting the recruiting of large numbers of the violet race, something could be done in the meantime, immediately, to advance the needy, waiting tribes. Zarathustra contended that if the Nodites, as the most progressive and cooperative race, could have a leader born to them of part origin in the violet stock, it would constitute a powerful tie binding these peoples more closely to the garden. And all of this was soberly and honestly considered to be for the good of the world, since this child, to be reared and educated in the garden, would exert a great influence for good over his father's people. It should again be emphasized that Zarathustra was altogether honest and wholly sincere in all he proposed. He never once suspected that he was playing into the hands of Caligasta and Dalagasta. Zarathustra was entirely loyal to the plan of building up a strong reserve of the violet race before attempting the worldwide upstepping of the confused peoples of Urantia. But this would require hundreds of years to consummate, and he was impatient. He wanted to see some immediate results, something in his own lifetime. He made it clear to Eve that Adam was oftentimes discouraged by the little that had been accomplished towards uplifting the world. For more than 5 years, these plans were secretly matured. At last, they had developed to the point where Eve consented to have a secret conference with Cain, the most brilliant mind and active leader of the nearby colony of friendly Nodites. Cain was very sympathetic with the Adamic regime. In fact, he was the sincere spiritual leader of those neighboring Nodites who favored friendly relations with the garden. The fateful meeting occurred during the twilight hours of the autumn evening, not far from the home of Adam. Eve had never before met the beautiful and enthusiastic Cain, and he was a magnificent specimen of the survival of the superior physique and outstanding intellect of his remote progenitors of the prince's staff. And Cain also thoroughly believed in the righteousness of the Zarathustra project, and outside the garden, multiple mating was a common practice. Influenced by flattery, enthusiasm, and great personal persuasion, Eve then and there consented to embark upon the much-discussed enterprise to add her own little scheme of world-saving to the larger and more far-reaching divine plan. Before she quite realized what was transpiring, the fatal step had been taken. It was done. The celestial life of the planet was astir. Adam recognized something was wrong, and he asked Eve to come aside with him in the garden. And now, for the first time, Adam heard the entire story of the long-nourished plan for accelerating world improvement by operating simultaneously in two directions: the prosecution of the divine plan concomitantly with the execution of the Zarathustra enterprise. And as the material son and daughter thus communed in the moonlit garden, the voice in the garden reproved them for disobedience, and that voice was none other than my own announcement to the Edenic pair that they had transgressed the garden covenant, that they had disobeyed the instructions of the Melchizedeks, that they had defaulted in the execution of their oath of trust to the sovereign of the universe. Eve had consented to participate in the practice of good and evil. Good is the carrying out of the divine plans. Sin is a deliberate transgression of the divine will. Evil is the misadaptation of plans and the maladjustment of techniques, resulting in universe disharmony and planetary confusion. Every time the garden pair had partaken of the fruit of the tree of life, they had been warned by the archangel custodian to refrain from yielding to the suggestions of Caligasta to combine good and evil. They had been thus admonished: in the day that you commingle good and evil, you will surely become as the mortals of the realm. You shall surely die. Well, Eve had told Cain of this oft-repeated warning on the fateful occasion of their secret meeting, but Cain, not knowing the import or significance of such admonitions, had assured her that men and women with good motives and true intentions could do no evil, that she should surely not die, but rather live anew in the person of their offspring, who would grow up to bless and stabilize the world. Even though this project of modifying the divine plan had been conceived and executed with entire sincerity, with only the highest motives concerning the welfare of the world, it constituted evil because it represented the wrong way to achieve righteous ends, because it departed from the right way, the divine plan. True Eve had found Cain pleasant to the eyes, and she realized all that her seducer promised by way of new and increased knowledge of human affairs and quickened understanding of human nature as supplemental to the comprehension of the Adamic nature. I talked to the father and mother of the violet race that night in the garden, as became my duty under the sorrowful circumstances. I listened fully to the recital of all that led up to the default of Mother Eve, and gave both of them advice and counsel concerning the immediate situation. Some of this advice they followed, some they disregarded. This conference appears in your records as the Lord God calling to Adam and Eve in the garden and asking, "Where are you?" It was the practice of later generations to attribute everything unusual and extraordinary, whether natural or spiritual, directly to the personal intervention of the gods. And Eve's disillusionment was truly pathetic. Adam discerned the whole predicament, and while heartbroken and dejected, entertained only pity and sympathy for his erring mate. It was in the despair of the realization of failure that Adam, the day after Eve's misstep, sought out Leota, the brilliant Nodite woman who was head of the Western schools of the garden, and with premeditation committed the folly of Eve. But do not misunderstand. Adam was not beguiled. He knew exactly what he was about. He deliberately chose to share the fate of Eve. He loved his mate with a supermortal affection, and the thought of the possibility of a lonely vigil on Urantia without her was more than he could endure. When they learned about what had happened to Eve, the infuriated inhabitants of the garden became unmanageable. They declared war on the nearby Nodite settlement. They swept out through the gates of Eden and down upon these unprepared people, utterly destroying them. Not a man, woman, or child was spared, and Caino, the father of Cain, yet unborn, also perished. Upon realization of what had happened, Sarapatasha was overcome with consternation and beside himself with fear and remorse. The next day he drowned himself in the great river. The children of Adam sought to comfort their distracted mother while their father wandered in solitude for 30 days. At the end of that time, judgment asserted itself, and Adam returned to his home and began to plan for their future course of action. The consequences of the follies of misguided parents are so often shared by their innocent children. The upright and noble sons and daughters of Adam and Eve were overwhelmed by the inexplicable sorrow of the unbelievable tragedy which had been so suddenly, so ruthlessly thrust upon them. Not in 50 years did the older of these children recover from the sorrow and sadness of those tragic days, especially the terror of that period of 30 days during which their father was absent from home while their distracted mother was in complete ignorance of his whereabouts or fate. And those same 30 days were as long years of sorrow and suffering to Eve. Never did this noble soul fully recover from the effects of that excruciating period of mental suffering and spiritual sorrow. no feature of their subsequent deprivations and material hardships ever began to compare in Eve's memory with those terrible days and awful nights of loneliness and unbearable uncertainty. She learned of the rash act of Zarathustra, and did not know whether her mate had in sorrow destroyed himself or had been removed from the world in retribution for her misstep. And when Adam returned, Eve experienced a satisfaction of joy and gratitude that never was effaced by their long and difficult life partnership of toiling service. Time passed, but Adam was not certain of the nature of their offense until 70 days after the default of Eve, when the Melchizedek receivers returned to Urantia and assumed jurisdiction over world affairs, and then he knew they had failed. The Edenic pair were informed that they had degraded themselves to the status of the mortals of the realm, that they must henceforth conduct themselves as man and woman of Urantia, looking to the future of the world races for their future. Long before Adam and Eve left Jerusalem, their instructors had fully explained to them the consequences of any vital departure from the divine plans. I had personally and repeatedly warned them, both before and after they arrived on Urantia, that reduction to the status of mortal flesh would be the certain result, the sure penalty, which would unfailingly attend default in the execution of their planetary mission. But a comprehension of the immortality status of the material order of sonship is essential to a clear understanding of the consequences attendant upon the default of Adam and Eve. The material son and daughter of Urantia, being also personalized in the similitude of the mortal flesh of the world, were further dependent on the maintenance of a dual circulatory system, the one derived from their physical natures, the other from the super energy stored in the fruit of the tree of life. Always had the archangel custodian admonished Adam and Eve that default of trust would culminate in degradation of the status, and access to this source of energy was denied them subsequent to their default. Caligasta did succeed in trapping Adam and Eve, but he did not accomplish his purpose of leading them into open rebellion against the universe government. What they had done was indeed evil, but they were never guilty of contempt for truth, neither did they knowingly enlist in rebellion against the righteous rule of the universal Father and his Creator Son. Adam and Eve did fall from their high estate of material sonship down to the lowest status of mortal man, but that was not the fall of man. The human race has been uplifted despite the immediate consequences of the Adamic default. Although the divine plan of giving the violet race to the Urantia peoples miscarried, the mortal races have profited enormously from the limited contribution which Adam and his descendants made to the Urantia races. There has been no fall of man. The history of human race is one of progressive evolution, and the Adamic bestowal left the world peoples greatly improved over their previous biological condition. The more superior stocks of Urantia now contain inheritance factors derived from as many as 4 separate sources: andinite, sandic, nodite, and Adamic. Adam should not be regarded as the cause of a curse on the human race. While he did fail in carrying forward the divine plan, while he did transgress his covenant with deity, while he and his mate were most certainly degraded in creature status, notwithstanding all this, their contribution to the human race did much to advance civilization on Urantia. In estimating the results of the Adamic mission on your world, justice demands the recognition of the condition of the planet. Adam was confronted with a well-nigh hopeless task when, with his beautiful mate, he was transported from Jerusalem to this dark and confused planet. But had they been guided by the counsel of Melchizedek and their associates, had they been more patient, they would have eventually met with success. But Eve listened to the insidious propaganda of personal liberty and planetary freedom of action. She was led to experiment with the live plasma of the material order of sonship, in that she allowed this life trust to become prematurely commingled with that of the then mixed order of the original design of the life carriers, which had been previously combined with that of the reproducing beings once attached to the staff of planetary prince. Never in all your ascent to paradise will you gain anything by impatiently attempting to circumvent the established and divine plan by shortcuts, personal inventions, or other devices for improving on the way of perfection, to perfection, and for eternal perfection. All in all, there probably never was a more disheartening miscarriage of wisdom on any planet in all Nebuchadnezzar. But it is not surprising that these missteps occur in the affairs of the evolutionary universes. We are part of a gigantic creation, and it is not strange that everything does not work in perfection. Our universe was not created in perfection. Perfection is our eternal goal, not our origin. And this was presented by Salonia, the seraphic voice in the garden. Callie, would you share further about this story?
The body cells of the material sons and their progeny are far more resistant to disease than are those of the evolutionary beings indigenous to the planet. The body cells of the native races are akin to the living disease-producing microscopic and ultramicroscopic organisms of the realm. These facts explain why the Urantia peoples must do so much by way of scientific effort to withstand so many physical disorders. You would be far more disease-resistant if your races carried more of the Adamic life. Not long after the establishment of the second Eden, Adam and Eve were duly informed that their repentance was acceptable, and that while they were doomed to suffer the fate of the mortals of the world, they should certainly become eligible for admission to the ranks of the sleeping survivors of Urantia. They fully believed this gospel of resurrection and rehabilitation, which the Melchizedek so touchingly proclaimed to them. Their transgression had been an error of judgment, and not the sin of conscious and deliberate rebellion. Adam knew about the dispensational resurrection which occurred simultaneously with his arrival on the planet, and he believed that he and his companion would probably be repersonalized in connection with the event of the next order of sonship. He did not know that Michael, the sovereign of this universe, was so soon to appear on Urantia. He expected that the next son to arrive would be of the Avenal order. Even so, it was always a comfort to Adam and Eve, as well as something difficult for them to understand, to ponder the only personal message they ever received from Michael. This message, among other expressions of friendship and comfort, said, "I have given consideration to the circumstances of your default. I have remembered the desire of your hearts, ever to be loyal to my Father's will, and you will be called from the embrace of mortal slumber when I come to Urantia, if the subordinate sons of my realm do not send for you before that time. And this was a great mystery to Adam and Eve. They could comprehend the veiled promise of a possible special resurrection in this message, and such a possibility greatly cheered them, but they could not grasp the meaning of the intimation that they might rest until the time of a resurrection associated with Michael's personal appearance on Urantia, and so the Adenic pair always proclaimed that the Son of God would sometime come, and they communicated to their loved ones the belief, at least, the longing hope, that the world of their blunders and sorrows might possibly be the realm whereon the ruler of this universe would elect to function as the paradise bestowal son. It seemed too good to be true, but Adam did entertain the thought that strife-torn Urantia might, after all, turn out to be the most fortunate world in the system of Satania, the envied planet of all Nebadon. Adam lived for 530 years. He died of what might be termed old age. His physical mechanism simply wore out. The process of disintegration gradually gained on the process of repair, and the inevitable came. Eve had died 19 years previously of a weakened heart. They were both buried in the center of the temple of divine service, which had been built in accordance with their plans soon after the wall of the colony had been completed. And this was the origin of the practice of burying noted and pious men and women under the floors of places of worship. The supermaterial government of Urantia, under the direction of the Melchizedeks, continued, but direct physical contact with the evolutionary races had been severed. From the distant days of the arrival of the corporal staff of the planetary princes down through the times of Van and Amadon, to the arrival of Adam and Eve, physical representatives of the universe government had been stationed on the planet. But with the Adamic default, this regime extended over a period of more than 450,000 years came to an end. In the spiritual spheres, angelic helpers continued to struggle in conjunction with the thought adjusters, both working heroically for the salvage of the individual, but no comprehensive plan for the far-reaching world welfare was promulgated to the mortals of earth until the arrival of Machiaventa Melchizedek in the times of Abraham, who with the power, patience, and authority of a son of God did lay the foundations for the further uplift and spiritual rehabilitation of unfortunate Urantia. Misfortune has not, however, been the sole lot of Urantia. This planet has been the most fortunate in local universe of Nebadon. Urantians should count it all gain if the blunders of their ancestors and the mistakes of their early world rulers so plunged the planet into such a hopeless state of confusion, all the more confounded by evil and sin, that this very background of darkness should so appeal to Michael of Nebadon, that he selected this world as the arena wherein to reveal the loving personality of the Father in heaven. It is not that Urantia needed a creator son to set its tangled affairs in order. It is rather that the evil and sin on Urantia afforded the creator son a more striking background against which to reveal the matchless love, mercy, and patience of the Paradise Father. Adam and Eve went to their mortal rest with strong faith in the promises made to them by the Melchizedeks that they would sometime awake from their sleep of death to resume life on the mansion worlds, worlds all so familiar to them in the days preceding their mission in the material flesh of the violet race on Urantia. They did not long rest in the oblivion of unconscious sleep of the mortals of the realm. On the third day after Adam's death, the second following his reverent burial, the orders of Langeford, sustained by the acting Most High of Edentia, and concurring in the union of days on Salvington, acting from Michael, were placed in Gabriel's hands, directing the special roll call of the distinguished survivors of the Adamic default on Urantia. And in accordance with this mandate of special resurrection, number 26 of the Urantia series, Adam and Eve were repersonalized and reassembled in the resurrection halls of the mansion worlds of Satania together with 1,316 of their associates in the experience of the first garden. Many other loyal souls had already been translated at the time of Adam's arrival, which was attended by the dispensational education of both the sleeping survivors and of the living qualified ascenders. Adam and Eve quickly passed through the worlds of progressive ascension until they attained citizenship on Jerusalem, once again to be residents of the planet of their origin, but this time as members of a different order of universe personalities. They left Jerusalem as permanent citizens, sons of God. They returned as ascendant citizens, sons of man. They were immediately attached to the Urantia service on the system capital, later being assigned membership among the 4 and 20 counselors who constitute the present advisory control body of Urantia. And thus ends the story of the planetary Adam and Eve of Urantia, a story of trial, tragedy, and triumph, at least personal triumph, for your well-meaning but deluded material son and daughter, and undoubtedly, in the end, a story of ultimate triumph for the world and its rebellion-tossed and evil-harassed inhabitants. When all is summed up, Adam and Eve made a mighty contribution to the speedy civilization and accelerated biologic process of human race. They left a great culture on Earth, but it was not possible for such an advanced civilization to survive in the face of the early dilution and eventual submergence of the Adamic inheritance. It is the people who make a civilization. Civilization does not make the people. Presented by Salonia, the seraphic voice in the garden. UrantianArtist, that was certainly a dramatic story, and I can see why you wanted to title it a love story, as I can see how Adam and Eve were created by our Creator's Son to be a descending son and daughter, to carry out a mission to uplift our world with their posterity. I'm impressed in what you've read, and that they were always sincere and loyal to wanting to make, their best decisions. It is often that way with us. We may want to make a good decision also, but the Lucifer line is still flooding our world, and we hear it every day in the media. So many holy material things get in the way of our spiritual goals. In other words, our goals should illuminate our eternal path to keep the connection with our Father in heaven continuous, alive, and vibrant. We need to keep our hearts, minds, body, and soul also in tune and aligned with the will of our Father. It isn't just something we do once a week on the Sabbath. We should be in thought and in deed always ready for that moment when the Father will prompt us to do His bidding and His will as we live the most highest concept of the highest ideal, which will always lead us further into the living light of the Father of lights, depending not upon yourself but upon the Father to guide you into the future estates which await all of us who will patiently, diligently, and persistently desire to do His will, and to find the sublime peace and superb joy which is connected with being more and more like the Father. Heavenly Father has prepared us for our unique mission on earth. He has given us His Spirit, who has brought us a preliminary destiny for us to desire. Lucifer wants to block that message and have us live our life thinking of that which is non-reality. May we live our life as Jesus did, in the consciousness and presence of God.
Thank you, Callie, for being my associate. I desire to end this podcast and wish to thank all who have commented and left such encouraging words. I invite you to each share insights about the story of Adam and Eve as told as a love story. Aloha nui loa.